Okay, so in this video, we're just going to be talking about how to go from our classes in processing to our classes in P5. Overall, it's pretty similar, but there are a couple syntax changes that can make your code break. And then also this has come up a couple times in office hours already. So just to make sure that we have sort of an idea of how to do it, I figured this might be helpful. So the two main differences are we don't have any data type declaration, which we saw in our setup video as well. We don't need to say int, float, string, void, whatever before our functions. We also don't need to say that before our variables because JavaScript only has two kinds of variables, either consts or lets. We also have a new keyword called this. You guys will see this in action, but basically this is the JavaScript version of having class members. So we actually don't have any variables as part of our class in JavaScript. It's set up a little bit differently and it's set up using this keyword, but we will talk about all of this. So to start off, I've just written this really quick class in processing, and this is called student. So basically it stores the student number, the first name, last name, an array of classes that the student is taking, which are all strings, so we can see because it has string before the array brackets, and a float for the student's GPA. Here is our constructor. So you guys have seen all of this stuff before pretty much, but just to make sure we sort of know what functions we want to write when we do move over to writing it in JavaScript. So this is our constructor. It's taking in a student number, a first name, a last name, and a grade. And then we're just setting that to be equal to our class members so that the class can store all of those things. You also may notice I didn't set anything for our classes array in our constructor. That's totally allowed. You do not have to set every single data type or every single data member in your constructor. Some of them can just be blank if you're not going to use them at first, or if you have a different function setting them. These two functions are called, or I guess what I call getters. So this one gets the student's GPA. So if we run this on a student object, we're going to get their GPA back. This one does the same thing, but for the student number. These two functions are what allows us to add and remove classes from the student's schedule. So the add function is pretty simple. We're basically just inputting an array of new classes. You could also just write this for one class at a time, but I figured that probably if you're going to add a bunch at once, you don't want to run this function over and over and over. So I just have this one. It takes in an array called class names, goes through the array using a for loop, and then appends each of the things in the array to our existing classes array. So this is the remove function. So if we want to take out a class from a student's schedule, this is what we're going to use. Basically, it does sort of the same thing, but instead of adding something onto the end, we're now looking for something. And if it exists, we're going to remove it. So really quickly, basically we're inputting a class name. Then we're going through our existing classes array. So whatever is already stored up here, we're going to go through that using a for loop. Check if whatever we put in as our function parameter matches anything already in the array. If it does, we remove it. You may notice I didn't write an else statement because if it doesn't exist, I don't really want the function to do anything. I don't need it to do anything. If you wanted to write an else statement, you could just say input class doesn't exist, because if this class doesn't match something in the array, we can't really remove anything. So you could do a console message. I chose nothing because this is just a demo, but do what you feel. And then inside of this, I used what I call a helper function. So this function basically is going through the array and looking to see if something matches. This is the thing that's actually going to take whatever we put in out of the array. So I like to keep my functions doing one task. That's just what makes most sense to me. And it's also sort of how I was taught to program in CSS, or C++. So for remove class, it's basically going to run if any one of the classes that we already have in the array matches whatever we put in. and then go through the array and remove it, basically. So first I'm finding the index of the class we want to take out, and then moving all of the classes after that back one space, so essentially deleting it. And then I'm shortening our array by 1 using the shorten function. This one just changes the student number if we want to do that. This one is changing the student's first name. You could also do one for a last name. I chose not to. And this one prints all of the info we have about the student. This one is just, I find, a generally good one to have in like almost any program, just to troubleshoot stuff in case you need it. So I almost always have a print function, but you don't need one. Yeah. So that's basically our overview of our class in processing. Now let's talk about how to write it in JavaScript. So to start out, I already have my JavaScript window open. It's just blank, it's not saved as anything, and I'm writing this in Visual Studio. So to start out, I'm basically just going to copy this first line exactly. So it's just class student with an opening curly bracket. So I'm just going to copy and paste that. And then I'm going to do my matching closing curly bracket to make sure I don't forget that later. And then because this file isn't saved yet, nothing is sort of lighting up. I'm not getting any highlighting right now, which is really helpful to have, especially if you're trying to troubleshoot. So even though I just have this one line, I'm just going to save this file. I'll just call it, what should we call it? Classes demo. I'm just going to save it and then save it as a JavaScript file. So remember your extension, because that's what's going to give us all of the highlighting and all of the nice features the Visual Studio or whatever other editor you're using has. So I'm just going to save that, and then we should see the colors pop in. So the first thing we want to talk about now is our constructor. So in processing, this is what our constructor function looks like. Void student, and then all of the rest of it. I'm just going to copy and paste this and then comment it out, because we pretty much are not going to use any of this. It's a little bit different in JavaScript, and this is where our this keyword comes in. So in JavaScript, when we're using classes, we have to have a constructor, and we can't call that constructor like we're doing in processing with just the name of it being the same as the class name. We actually have to call it constructor. So I'm just going to type constructor, all lowercase, and then opening and closing brackets, round brackets, and then opening and closing curly brackets. And I'm just going to give myself some space. So this constructor is what is going to create our object, our student object. So basically, inside of the curly brackets, pretty much the same idea so far. We're just going to put in whatever we want to take in. So you can see up here, I initially, for my processing class, took in the student number, the first name, the last name, and the grade. So I'm going to use the exact same variable names here. But remember, I don't have to add any data types. So I can just say num, f name, L name, and grade. And I'm just going to space it out a bit because it makes it look a bit nicer. And then we're going to go inside of the class. So in our processing class, we can see that we set our member variables to whatever we put in. This is where we're going to use the this keyword in JavaScript. So instead of setting whatever we put in to the class members that are already saved, I'm just going to say this dot, and then whatever I want the class variable to be. So in my processing code, I called it student num, first name, last name, classes, and GPA. So those are the same names that I'm going to use here. So this dot student num equals, and we want it equal to our num, so we're just going to say equals num. And then new line. You don't have to put semicolons in JavaScript. I sometimes do as a force of habit. It won't break your code, but it's not necessary. And then same thing. So first name, last name. We're going to use the same layout here. So this dot first name equals whatever the user puts in. fname, this dot last name equals lname, and this dot, what did we call it here? GPA equals grade. So basically, this keyword is saying for a specific object of the class, set these 4 properties onto it. So it's the same sort of idea as using class member variables. This is just the JavaScript way to do it. It's not too big of a change, but make sure you remember to do it or else your code's going to break. And then the last thing we want to do, we can see in our processing code that we had an empty array called classes. We're also going to add that. Again, initialization is a little bit different for JavaScript compared to P5. So instead of string with array brackets, classes equals open and closing curly brackets, we're just going to say this dot classes, because that's the name of the array, equals empty square brackets. And that's it. So that's our constructor. After that, let's add our functions. So I'm going to start with these two because these two are really easy. I'm just going to copy and paste them. The only change with these two is actually that we can just take out the return type of the function. So we can just delete float and delete int. Now these are good to go. So we're all good, except we also have to add the this keyword, this.gpa and this.studentnum. So we have to just make sure that we're adding this whenever we use one of these names so that our class knows what to do. But yeah, so those are our first 2 functions, all set, all good to go. Now let's add our functions to add and remove classes from the student schedule. So I'm just going to copy all 3 of these and then move back over here and then just paste them. So you can see we're already getting a whole bunch of errors. That's okay. First thing we're going to do, take out all of the return types from every one of the classes. So all the voids, she can go, we don't need her. After that, I'm going to take out the data type of whatever variables we're using in the round brackets here. So taking out the data type of all of our parameters. JavaScript doesn't need to know that, so we don't have to give it that information. So take that out, take this one out, and then take this one out down here. And now that's that error gone. After that, I'm going to add my this keyword, and we know we need to use it on any member of the class. So basically, how I remember it is anything that I used this for in my constructor, I also have to use this for everywhere else in the code. So classes here is the same thing as classes here. So I'm just going to say this dot classes. Down here as well, this dot, and this dot classes. And then classes also down here as well. But you guys get the idea. Basically, just anywhere we're saying classes, added this. This is also going to change a little bit, but it's okay. Not too big a change. The last thing we have to do is, again, in our for loop, we don't have to tell JavaScript that I is an int. And then one last tiny thing. In JavaScript, we don't use the append function. The equivalent of that is called push. So basically our array functions in JavaScript are push and pop. Those are the 2 main ones. Push adds something onto the end of an array. Pop takes something off of the end of the array. So this dot classes, instead of append, we're just going to say push. And now this one should be good. And this one we don't really need to change anything because we used a helper function. Love to see it. And so in our helper function, we're going to do sort of the same thing, but instead of pushing this time, we want to pop. So we're just going to say pop down here. And then we should be good. So the last 3 I'm going to add are just these 3. So our 2 things to change the number and name of the student, and then also our print function. These ones are a lot easier. I guess not a lot. They're slightly easier. So again, same first steps, just take out the return types of the function and then take out anywhere we're declaring the data type of our parameter. So we do it in all of these. Let's take all that out. And now we're going to add this anywhere we're using one of these variables. So we say student num, that matches. So we're just going to say this dot. First name also matches up here. So this dot. Okay, so now for our print function, we're gonna just change all of the times we used print or print line or print array here to console.log. It's basically the JavaScript version of print line, and it does exactly the same thing and has pretty much the same layout. So I'm just gonna say console.log everywhere I use a print statement. Nope, that's not how you spell console. Okay. And then same thing here. I'm just going to add the this keyword to every time I use any of the variables up here that have this in front of it. So that's pretty much all of them down here. So I'm just going to add it everywhere. Okay, and then one more thing that I realized I forgot to do when we were writing this is we do actually have another, oh, or not, do we? Yeah, we do have another print statement up here. So I'm just going to change that one to console.log as well. And then after that, we should be good. I'm going to put this and the processing code on the GitHub that I've sent to some people, and then also just in Microsoft Teams for you guys to download if you guys want a reference or anything. Yeah, and then sometimes, I know that we've talked about this a little bit for processing as well, but sometimes the error that you get in JavaScript is not going to match up with what's actually wrong. So as an example of that, one thing that confused a couple people earlier this week was that when they left int in their for loop, they were getting an error that said semicolon expected above their I. That's really easy to fix. You just take out int, but the computer doesn't know what error is happening all the time. So sometimes you just have to sort of figure it out based on your knowledge of the coding environment or by Googling it. With a lot of coding and especially well-documented languages like P5, it's really easy to find help online. I know a lot of you guys have been using the processing docs and the P5 docs, which is awesome. Those are really great resources. There's also a website called Stack Overflow, which has the answer to every coding question you ever could have. It's an amazing resource. It's basically like a forum, but just for coding stuff. And a lot of people who have been working in coding for a long time post answers there. So it's a really, really good place to look. And then also just Googling stuff. Google is really helpful for a lot of these errors because coding errors are often pretty common for people. So someone has probably had whatever issue you're having before. Of course, if those don't work, feel free to ask Maya or Andre or I. But I think getting used to Googling errors on your own is going to be really helpful, especially if you guys want to continue doing coding after this course. Yeah. But yeah, that's it for this video. I hope you guys found it helpful and good luck with your projects.